Okay, so my mom was a huge fan of the saddest songs on the planet. It was
Okay.
always Send in the Clowns, Sunshine on My Shoulders, Leaving on a Jet Plane. There was a lot of John Denver going on in our house. And I always asked her, Mom, why is it? And actually, whenever we went home to Taiwan, it was this whenever we'd go to karaoke bars, it would always be the saddest songs that got played for us. So I would ask around, Mom, I would ask my cousins, I would ask my aunts and my uncles, why is it that Taiwanese people are so obsessed with sad music? And she'd say, well, we had a hard life, and it's kind of true. Taiwan's been occupied pretty much since the very, very beginning, right? So
Yes.
I mean, the Olympics are going on right now, right? And
Right.
what are we known as in the Olympics? We are Chinese Taipei. Hello? I mean, how do you even? And I remember the first year I ever realized that this was happening, I was like, "What? That's not Taiwan." I'm so confused. Like, how is that? How is that even reality? But yeah. So to her point, the reason Taiwanese people love sad music is because we led sad, sad lives for a real long time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. And joining me tonight is a guest that I found online. Shun Lai wrote a fascinating article about her complicated relationship with Born in the USA and Bruce's music. And I was captivated by the article. And so, as I'm known to do, which I only have a 50% hit rate, I reach out to the writer via social media and go, hey, any chance you want to join me on the podcast? And Yishan was nice enough to say yes. So, first off, thank you for joining me and welcome to the show.
Oh, Jesse, it is my absolute honor to be here. I was so psyched to see your invitation, and I'm now a fan of the podcast, so I'm just honored to be here. Thanks so much for having me and for reaching out.
That is so nice. So, uh, we're going to get to this, but I'm going to I want to kind of explain to people why you wrote that article, and then we'll get to my normal questions about your background and how you discovered Bruce. But I find it fascinating this why you have a complicated relationship with Bruce. So can you mind kind of giving like a quick summary, and then we'll get into more depth in a little bit?
Yeah, not at all. So this actually gets a little bit into your questions about what we listened to when I was growing
Yeah.
up in my house. And my dad was always really serious about classical music. For him, it was like the only music that you could really listen to, right? So it
Right.
wasn't until I was 8 or 9 when we moved to California and the kids next door were playing pop music, right,
Yeah.
from the Go-Go's and and that era. What's the stuff that was going on back then? I can't even remember now, but I remember hearing this music and thinking, what is this music, right? But then shortly afterwards, my brother was involved either in the Cub Scouts or in Indian Guides. And we were at one of those camping weekends, and some kids from school were blasting Born in the USA really, really loud. And they were kind of stalking my family's tent, back and forth. And for those of you who are not watching the video and who are listening to the podcast, I'm Asian American, right? So my family immigrated from Taiwan when I was 3 or 4, and it became pretty obvious, that they were kind of targeting us for not being born in the USA. And at that point in time, I kind of knew already what the song was about, right? It's not at all about whether or not you're actually born in the USA. It's about the experience of being an American citizen and what it's like to serve your country and then come back and
Absolutely.
feel left
Yes.
behind, right? So even though I knew what it was about, I still couldn't get away from that visceral feeling of not being American, So it took me a long time to get back into Bruce and to really listen to his lyrics beyond that lovely bark yelling that I love so much now, that he does in Born in the USA, and really pay attention to the lyrics and get to really admire him as a songwriter. So yeah,
Well,
it's complicated.
it is, and so what I was telling my wife that earlier this evening that I was going to have you on, and I said, and I'm oversimplifying it, but it I and I did a quote unquote impersonation of you, right? Like, you know, Badlands, yay, yay, yay. Born in the USA, you would sit quietly, your hands folded, and then, then, you know, uh, backs, and then immediately back to, Sherry Darland. It's just like this, like almost a like some football players kneel, for the national anthem, right? Like you're like
Yeah.
my little silent protest or just uncomfortableness of Born in the USA, and then
Yeah.
immediately back to enjoying the rest of the show.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the really interesting thing about the songs you've chosen versus the song I knew is that everything that I knew about Bruce was channeled through this sort of like Southern California 1980s pop lens, right?
Right.
So all the stuff it was Hungry Heart, it was Pink Cadillac, which I didn't understand for a long time.
Right.
It was Hungry Heart, it was Dancing in the USA or Dancing in the Streets, right?
Yeah.
And so, there was this music that was more pop oriented that didn't really allow me to access Bruce Springsteen as I should have really, been
Yeah.
accessing him as a writer, right?
Right.
But the thing about it too is that it wasn't so much a protest for me. It was just like deep, deep discomfort. This
Yes.
idea of like people around me might not understand that I could love the song and love the lyrics and love the very Americanness of its protest and still be singing along. I worried that they would look at me and feel like I didn't deserve to be singing Born in the USA along with them at a concert. I worried that it would be like, oh, she's obviously not from here, right? They would look at me and kind of say that.
And there is a, I'm a 62-year-old white guy that grew up in Louisiana, and then moved to Dallas like in 1980, like 86. So, I've been a Texan for now decades, and just this very insulated world. And I'm constantly surprised at the people who don't acknowledge that there is a different viewpoint than their own. I
Mm-hmm.
because I realize, my viewpoint as this middle-aged, middle class, straight white guy is
Mm,
a very unique perspective compared to someone of a different origin. Even if they were even born in the USA, pardon the pun, it is a
yeah.
different perspective, right?
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is really important for a couple different reasons. But the thing that stands out to me the most is that you have recognized who you are and where you're coming from, right?
Yes.
You are a middle-aged white male. You live in Texas. You're very sure of who you are. And I think what's missing in a lot of these conversations is that people don't really understand that who you are and where your origins come from, i.e., your belief systems, the religion you grew up in, all of that stuff, has a really solid formation or it creates this foundation on which you grew up and which your opinions are formed, right?
Hmm.
But a lot of people don't want to admit that. They don't want to say, "Oh, I grew up in this kind of household. I have this ethnic marker, right?" So for me, and actually that's true for me too. East Asians, I'm Taiwanese American. Have this kind of really weird space in the American zeitgeist where, because our economic earnings are roughly the same as white Americans and because our education aspirations are roughly the same, we kind of fall to the wayside. We're always told early on not to rock the boat, right? So that creates this kind of weird gap. It's a weird vacuum that we live in, right?
Yeah.
So I have to practice myself at saying I am East Asian, right? I come from an upper middle class background. I've never ever wanted for money. That makes me highly privileged. I went to a top 10 liberal arts college, which makes me highly insular, and I have a Master of Fine Arts degree. Hello. I mean, how much more privilege can you get? I spent 3 years navel gazing, like
Yeah.
working on my craft, hello, fainting couch, right? So it's like, without that kind of acknowledgement of who you are and where you come from, you can't really even begin to hope to understand other people's positions, can you?
No,
Right?
you can't.
So no, it's great that you brought that up. Thank you for doing that.
No. So let's get back to kind of give us your elevator pitch. We kind of jumped
Yeah.
right into the meat of the sandwich,
I know.
and I did not warn you, but I should have. I tend to go off on tangents, and you've been listening to the podcast, so I just I love talking to people and I love having conversations. And I truly do the podcast to entertain myself and
Yeah.
hopefully entertain my guests. Then I hope my audience comes along. But if my guests and I can have a good conversation, then I figure, okay, it's a success.
No,
So
that's wonderful.
I know you're a writer, but go ahead
Yeah.
and give us your elevator pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a writer for most of my professional life since I was 18 when I first started professionally publishing. I write mostly nonfiction at this point, but I have a novel that's out there that was published in 2016, which was a semifinalist for the Thurber Prize at American Humor. And my latest release is a memoir called Pinups, which is about my long, ugly relationship with outdoor sports and what that's taught me about being a woman in a man's world. So it's been a wild ride. I mean, I've been writing a lot more about what it's like to be an American, which is
Hmm.
where the essay that you found me via came through. Um, and it's been kind of a really interesting time for us to be alive, hasn't it?
It is an interesting time. And, you know, another podcast, um, Terry Smith does music talks, which is the premise of the podcast is you pick a song from every decade that you've been alive,
Oh, that's so cool.
and he interviews you and tells you the story, and it gives you it's a good excuse to kind of explore someone's life.
Yeah.
And so he had me on to pardon me, listeners, if you know the story, but Terry was a guest on my podcast. At the very end of the podcast, he says, "Hey, do you have a few minutes?" I go, "Yeah." And he told me about this premise, and I said, "Oh, I think that's a fascinating premise." So we had a couple of episodes on Set Listing Bruce where we did that, and then he spun his own podcast. And then
Oh,
for his
cool.
1 year anniversary, he says, "I want you as the guest because you kind of started this." And so he said, "Do you want to use your original 7 songs, or do you want to pick 7 new songs?" And I said, "No, I'll pick 7 new songs." And for the 60s, I picked "A Change Is Going to Come" from Sam Cooke
Oh,
because it
yeah.
was right after the George Floyd, you know.
Right. Right.
And he just recently celebrated 50 episodes, and he played a clip from that. And he
Okay.
warned, he says, "Jesse sounds emotional because when we recorded this, it was right after this." And I
Wow.
was saying almost in tears, this is a tough time for our country.
Hmm.
And it has remained that way. I went to dinner last night with my best friend from high school, and the amount of things he was saying, it, he is my age, still lives in Louisiana, and it was very much a red state mentality.
Sure.
And talking a lot about minorities, and
Hmm.
you know and it was uncomfortable for me, but at the same time, I know I love this man like a brother.
Yeah.
And we are so divided. In fact, I think one of the smartest things I read somewhere is the amount of criticism that Bruce got for that Super Bowl ad, the middle, from
Yeah.
both the far right and the far left, tells you how far away as a country we are from a middle,
Definitely.
you know.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that the time that we're in is really pushing us to I don't know, work towards our best humanity.
Yes.
But I also think one of the key things that tends to fall to the wayside in conversations about compassion and empathy is that the people like you who are having to navigate the awkward space between folks you know and love and their beliefs
Yeah.
are also in need of allyship. You
Yeah.
need support
Yeah.
from other angles of your life. You need to be well informed. You have to feel firm in your own beliefs, and you've got to feel firm enough in your own beliefs to be able to push back compassionately to people who are saying things you don't agree with, right? But also who have no experience with a lot of the things that they aren't in agreement with, right?
Yeah. It is. It's a really awkward, and I sit there and I go, and I've been lucky enough to have a wide range of guests join me on the podcast, and from different age groups, and I've had people from all over the world, and like when Bella Pori was an early guest, and
Mhm.
she talked about the streets of Philadelphia as how she discovered Bruce,
Yeah.
because being lesbian, the idea that song spoke to her,
Yeah.
because how often, and in fact, there was an episode where she had, Bruce Springsteen's gayest songs,
Yep.
because she had had these songs that in her mind she changed to that,
Yeah.
because there
Absolutely.
was, and it it is a, and I heard this from someone, and I wish I could give them credit, but he said the problem is we want to believe the very best of ourselves and think the worst of the person that we're talking with, instead of
Hmm.
hoping to think, well, I'm going to believe that they have a good heart, or they're going to, the best of them. It is this, and it is a lack of compassion and just a caringness that is just very difficult right now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there about compassion versus empathy, right?
Yeah,
Brene Brown is very popular these days, and she does great work, and a lot of her work is around empathy and vulnerability, right?
yeah,
But I think what's missing from that conversation is the idea that it can be very hard for a middle-aged white man or a middle-aged Asian woman like I am to have empathy for a young black man who's growing up in Philadelphia, right?
right.
We don't know what that life is. We don't know what it's impossible for us to step into his shoes, right? And when we do try, sometimes we stumble into the savior mode, where it's like,
Exactly.
oh, we're trying to we're coming from our highfalutin lives and we're going in and trying to fix your problems, right? Without knowing anything about what it is. But when you think about compassion, what you're doing is making room for the probability that this person's narrative is true, right? As
Yes.
opposed to saying my way or the highway, you're saying actually my way, your way, and everybody else's way in between, because I don't actually know, I don't actually know. But you've tackled another interesting thing here, which is the concept of goodness, right? The social psychologist Dolly Chugh, it's Chugh, has written a great book called "The Person You Want to Be," the person you mean to be, how good people fight by us. And her whole idea is that we shouldn't strive to be good people. We should strive to be goodish people, right? We should strive to
Ah,
be the best that we can possibly be, given all the information that we have at our fingertips. And if we're finding kind of a dearth of information, then we should go out and find it, right? We should go out and
yeah,
gather that information and kind of hope that we can fill in those gaps that we have in our knowledge or in our compassion or in our experience, right?
I absolutely agree. You mentioned your father was a love of classical music.
Yeah.
How about your mom? What kind of music did your mom listen to?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. Okay, so my mom was a huge fan of the saddest songs on the planet. It was
Okay.
always Send in the Clowns, Sunshine on My Shoulders, Leaving on a Jet Plane. There was a lot of John Denver going on in our house. And I always asked her, Mom, why is it? And actually, whenever we went home to Taiwan, it was this whenever we'd go to karaoke bars, it would always be the saddest songs that got played for us. So I would ask around, Mom, I would ask my cousins, I would ask my aunts and my uncles, why is it that Taiwanese people are so obsessed with sad music? And she'd say, well, we had a hard life, and it's kind of true. Taiwan's been occupied pretty much since the very, very beginning, right? So
Yes.
I mean, the Olympics are going on right now, right? And
Right.
what are we known as in the Olympics? We are Chinese Taipei. Hello?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you even? And I remember the first year I ever realized that this was happening, I was like, "What? That's not Taiwan. I'm so confused. Like, how is that? How is that even reality?" But yeah, so to her point, the reason Taiwanese people love sad music is because we led sad, sad lives for a real long time. So yes, there was a certain amount of maudlin singing going on in our households, which I think, and I would like to blame for my bizarre, kind of embarrassing obsession with Richard Marx and Michael Bolton in my high school years. I'm just going to
Okay.
put that out there right now,
That's
so I can
right.
just get it over
Yeah.
with. Okay, we're just gonna say that.
Okay, that's
Leave
fine.
it out there.
Well, see, I graduated high school in 1977, and top 40 radio, but I loved
Yeah.
Barry Manilow, and I still do.
Oh, that's so
And that is
beautiful.
can be so sappy. In fact, when we were talking about guilty pleasures, I was like,
Yeah.
I still every once in a while pull out a Barry Manilow CD and sing to the top of my lungs, these songs.
Oh, I love it. Does your wife indulge with you?
Yeah, my wife is a huge fan of Kate Bush,
Okay, cool.
from and ABBA,
Yeah,
and
okay.
so and the um, so she not so much Barry Manilow, and she has um, it. We had and I've told this story before when she says I don't understand anything what Bruce Springsteen is saying. It just sounds like he's grunting.
I remember you saying that. You're telling that
Yes.
story.
And so, that's when I said, okay, think of it as an instrumental. And so, just that his
That's
voice
funny.
is just another instrument. And that actually worked for her because
That's
she
great.
then could get the mood and the
Okay.
emotion of the song. So she is we have said that when he tours next year, she goes, I know you're going to want to go as many shows as you can. He says,
Yeah.
but I want to go at least one. And I'm like, absolutely,
Oh,
absolutely. Yeah.
that's wonderful. I
Yeah.
love it when people make concessions for each other like that.
Right.
That's a
Yeah.
beautiful
Absolutely.
thing. I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah, among my other proclivities in high school, let's see. Um, I did a lot of Bryan Adams,
Okay.
that whole cuts like a knife thing, right?
Sure.
I did a lot of Bon Jovi.
Yeah.
There was a reasonable amount of Def Leppard going on.
Hmm.
So yeah, it was super, really easily accessible pop music, which my parents were, oh my gosh, Tiffany. Do you remember Tiffany?
Sure.
And Debbie Gibson,
Oh,
and
yeah.
after Belinda Carlisle left the Go-Go's, right? Pat Benatar, I loved her to pieces. I thought she was such a strong woman.
Yeah.
And actually, now that I'm talking to you, I think, despite the fact that I feel like I've left most of the whole like sad music stuff
Yeah.
behind, the tunes I still kind of gravitate to in my head are always the ones that have terrible, terrible stories. Till Tuesday's Voices Carry. That's a
Yes.
that's a really awful one, right?
Yeah.
Um, Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart, right? With that
Right.
great line, "We're living in a powder keg and giving off sparks." Oh, that's such a
Yes.
great line. Um, let's see, what were the other sad tunes? It doesn't matter. I mean, a ton of them. Like every single one of them that I remember that I turn
Hmm.
to first on the
Yeah.
handy dandy satellite radio are the ones that are like super super sad.
So you talked about Indian Guides, Cub Scouts,
Yeah.
where you had this experience of hearing Born in the USA and everything. When did you discover more about Bruce? When you discovered the the broader catalog and his um his ability as a storyteller?
Yeah, no, it's those are actually two very different things.
Okay.
So the first was Born to Run, and the tune I loved, and it was a boyfriend at the time that I was dating who was really into like rock music. Okay, so
Okay.
he was Pink Floyd. He also was the one who introduced me to CCR, Creedence Clearwater
Yeah.
Revival, right? ELO, and alongside of that was Born to Run, right? And it was like, oh no, sorry, it was a Yes, that's right. Born to Run. That's right.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, this is interesting. It's catchy, right? I like the cut of this guy's jib, right? I like what he's doing with the tune. It sounds
Yeah.
joyful and good, right? But then years afterwards, I was living in New York City and I met a songwriter named Will Hawkins.
Okay.
And Will was a songwriter, still is a songwriter actually. And it was he that who introduced me to the idea of like songwriting as a thing, as a form of literature, right?
Right.
And so I would go to these songwriter circles that Will would participate in, and I would listen to each one of the lyricists, who were putting forth their works. And so it was then that he was like, oh, you should listen to some Bruce Springsteen, right? And then and there, I started paying more attention to the lyrics and kind of like figuring out what was going on, piecing it together. And that's when I ran into Thunder Road.
Because I could see, and you probably did not do this, but like Bruce Springsteen, the Hungry Heart guy, right? Right?
Well, no, for me it was like, wait, the pink Cadillac guy,
Yeah, the
'cause
big Cadillac guy. Yeah.
but then, when you go back to listen to Pink Cadillac, you're like, oh yeah, that's working for me. That's like
Yeah.
it's a different cast of things, right? So yeah, so Thunder Road was really the thing that really kind of tipped it over into true obsession zone, right? Where it was like I would listen to the lyrics over and over again and be like, how does he do it? How does he do it? It's completely unpredictable the way that the phrasing works and the way that he kind of mashes in the rhymes, right? Like this whole conversation that's been happening of late from that New Yorker article by David
Yeah.
Remnick about whether it's Mary's Dress Sways or Mary's Dress Waves.
Yeah.
And people are like, well, no, it doesn't really rhyme. And it's like, when has Bruce actually ever cared about proper rhyme schematics? He doesn't care.
Yeah.
He
And
doesn't care.
like Thunder Road has no verse, no chorus. It's just this story. And,
Yeah.
and we'll tease. I am now looking forward to hearing your Mary question answer, you know. Um,
I've been
and
thinking about it all week, Jesse.
that makes me so happy. It has turned into, and so it's what's hilarious, Yishan, is I was reached out by a record, like a publicity company, and they said, "Hey, we have a musician. Would you want to have them, on your show?" And I'm like, absolutely. I love talking to people. And so I had to, she's an African American. I'm going to talk to her this weekend. And she's, one of the things she wants to talk about is how hip hop is the future of music and all this other stuff. And I had to send it. I said, okay, have her listen to Thunder Road. I included a link to a live version and the studio version. Like, have her look at the lyrics, because I ask everyone the Mary
Yeah.
question at the end. And so,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
I was a little, 99% of Bruce's fans are great people. I think we are really blessed, whether it's the casual fan or the hardcore fan.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to be, as we call South, good people, right? You're good, you're good
Mm-hmm.
people. But there is just a small every once in a while, and this whole debate of ways and sways, and I mean, it is almost like red and blue states. I mean, they are like this
Or
this
is it like, do you see the red dress or the blue dress, or do you see
yes,
the gold dress, right? It's that whole
yeah.
thing.
It just like, there's not like, oh, okay, well, if because they're arguing with Landau, like Landau's, oh, it was supposed to be this, we're going to change it. Like, no, you're
Right.
wrong. Like, wait a minute, what do you and and not just a like I have no strong opinion. I personally, because I'm an optimist,
Uh-huh.
believe that Tony Soprano did not die in the final Sopranos episode. I like to believe that Tony is still out there trying to be a good father and is now grandfather to, Meadow and AJ's children. But if you go, oh no, absolutely, Jesse, he died, and here's all the
Uh-huh.
reasons why, I go, okay,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
choose to be an optimist that, the bad guy lived, but
Right.
I'm okay. But there is that, and it truly is kind of a symptom of how, to go back politically for just a few minutes, Yishan, I have a really good friend who tends to be, he's a small businessman, so he tends to be more conservative. But he says what bothers him is, he says, why can't you go, I want everyone to have health insurance, you want everyone to have health insurance. We we disagree how to get it. How come we can't find a middle ground to accomplish what we both want? You
Mm-hmm.
want a safe border, I want a safe border. Why
Mm-hmm.
we disagree how to currently do it? Why can't we find middle ground to accomplish something we both want?
Mm-hmm.
Politically, it is like, they don't even want to agree with what the end goal is.
Yeah, I think some of that comes back to that idea of what is good in our heads,
Yes.
right?
Right.
If my in-laws are really conservative, and
Yeah.
they are also members of a church that is highly conservative. So they are single issue voters, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Now, if I were to ask them, do you believe you're good people? They would say, oh, yes, of course. They're
Absolutely.
church going people. They're doing all the right things by the barometers of what's existing in their society.
Yeah.
They are good people, right? In my spare time, I do some disaster relief, okay? And I have seen the negative effects that the church can wreak on areas of very, very low income, where they just go in and they missionary the heck out of the place, right? But they don't provide sexual health care, or they don't provide birth control knowledge, right? Okay, so by my standards, maybe the church isn't doing great work, right, in that region, that particular narrow arena, right?
Right.
So the question of goodness, I think, gets in the way a lot a lot, right?
It really does, and like that gets my frustration specifically about reproductive rights is and I have brought this up in you know I would be much more supportive of someone who says I want to reduce unplanned pregnancies.
Hmm.
Okay. So that means you should support free or low cost birth control. You should
Right.
support a lot of sex education. You should report um, a social net to give people a choice. But no, your answer is don't have sex, right? And you're like, that just doesn't. This is it. Just doesn't make sense.
Well, I think it's very hard to see past it when every Sunday and maybe twice every week you're being told by a holy authority figure
Yeah.
that, this absoluteness is the only way to be good,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I think that's what it is, right? This only way to be good thing really gets in the way of us forming, I don't know, solutions, as you say,
Yeah.
right? It gets in the way of creative decision making or
Yeah.
of creative solution
Hmm.
making, right? So how do we kind of get past this notion of like what is good and what isn't good, right? Because
Yeah.
good's kind of subjective, isn't it? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
listen, I love me a fine tender fish ball, okay, but
Yeah.
my in-laws are not going to eat that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So
Yes.
yeah, I mean for me it's good. I also adore Cheez-Its. My husband thinks they're absolutely disgusting, right? So
Right.
it's just one of those things, if you want to break it
Yeah.
down to really inappropriately simple levels, that's kind of
No.
where I
No.
see it.
I totally get that. Um, I want to go just throw on your other hat. When did you know you wanted to write? Are you someone? And I'm my friend Tom is an artist, and he has made a living drawing, his life. And he said from the moment he had awareness, he knew he wanted to draw.
Okay.
And so talk to me about your writing, and was it that kind of calling, or was this late in life?
We do this thing in Taiwan where you set the baby, who is about somewhere 9 months old or so, or a year, on a table. And in front of the baby are the various implements of life. Okay.
Okay.
So you could have pens, abacuses, food, anything that actually might touch on any kind of career. And you, you let the baby crawl towards whatever it is. I went for the food. They decided that was not acceptable, so they set me back up again and they moved for something else, and I went for the pen. Right
Wow.
now, with that said, my maternal grandfather was a poet. My paternal grandfather and his father before him also wrote poetry. They're both published poets, right? I am terrified of poetry, just FYI. It's one of those things that I'm trying to kind of inch closer to. Growth mindset, right? I can do it. I can
Yeah.
do it. But I find it absolutely mind-boggling in lots of different ways, and just one of those things where I'm just always afraid I'm going to make the wrong move. But I do believe that from a very young age I was kind of called to this. So it feels like a vocation to me. It feels like a thing that I always knew I was going to do.
So you're not a frustrated chef?
I'm not impressed. You know what? That actually, now you got me thinking. I don't know. Let's circle back around to this another 6 months, and I'll let you know.
Okay,
I'm gonna I'm
okay,
gonna
okay,
I'm gonna start thinking about that now. You
okay.
got me thinking now. It's kind of
Well, there you
worrisome.
go. No, no, no. Just I think it's funny that So, talk to me about your early writing and what were you just you're. I've talked to a lot of people, and writing is something people can't. If you're a writer, it's something you can't not do. It's
Yeah.
just
Oh, yeah, I'm really glad that you said that because I think I used to say that a lot in my early 20s, right? Like people would say, "Oh, well, why are you a writer?" And I would say, "Oh, it's something I have to do. I'm driven to
yeah,
do it," right? But I don't think that I actually really understood what that meant until I got a grip on the things I liked, until I got a grip on the things I liked, period, right?
yeah.
So, what are the things that interest me? It turns out it's people, right? It turns out it's music. It turns out it's I have a column right in front of my office here, and there are
Hmm.
there's a bird's nest up there, right? And
Hmm.
so every year some bird couples come back and they fight over it, right? And so that drama is super interesting to me, right? Flora, fauna, leaves, things like that. All of that stuff is interesting to me. So once I got a grip on, the things that were interesting to me, I realized that there were stories behind all of that, right? So it wasn't just about people or the experiences I had at the very beginning of my like career, like when I
Hmm.
graduated from college and all that stuff. I fancied myself a writer of the outdoors persuasion. I thought I would go and report on things like wolf biologists, right, and trout fishermen and whatnot. And I was going to be the badass person. I can say that, right? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
The badass person who was going to be skiing down, aggressive slopes and telling you about it, right? I was going to be the John Krakauer of the female set. He wrote Into Thin Air, right,
Right.
and Into the Wild. And it turns out that I'm not that kind of writer. I'm the kind of writer who likes to imagine things, right? And who likes to pretend that animals can talk. And who
Hmm.
likes to imagine the conversations that they have with each other. And then I also like to navel gaze, apparently, which is the way that you found me.
Yeah.
so, so yeah. So in my other life, I also teach at a Master of Fine Arts program, which is creative nonfiction based. So encouraging people to tell their stories. That's a thing that I also think is pretty important. Making sure that longevity, that oral history gets somehow put down on paper is pretty important to me. So
Yeah.
maybe it's not so much like that I feel driven to write. It's that I feel driven to convey stories and driven to help people to convey their stories.
Um, so I love, and I think that's part of the reason why I do this podcast is I love hearing people's stories, and I feel it's important to capture them. I every once in a while, and I don't get it as much anymore, but when I first started the podcast, people would say, "Oh, I don't have anything interesting to tell," and I'm
Oh, that
like,
breaks my heart. I hate that.
and I'm like, no, it's funny, right? Like I'm still trying to get someone to be on the show. Um, she traveled to New Zealand and went to multiple shows the last time Bruce went there. And she's like, "Oh, I
Oh.
don't have any interesting stories." What? Just the story going to New Zealand would be, an episode. So I like that. I appreciate that. Um, so you mentioned you had an early novel.
Yeah.
Um, had you done short stories beforehand, or had you done what?
Yeah.
So
So for every published novelist, that novelist has like 5 or 6 novel drafts that are sitting somewhere in a drawer or on a hard
absolutely
drive. Okay.
right.
Mine are on floppy disks. Just FYI, I'm of
There you
that.
go.
I'm of that generation.
Okay, very
both
nice.
both the big 5.5 inch ones and the 3.5 inch hard ones. We all have that kind of stuff lying around. But at the beginning, I started writing short stories, and then decided I was gonna write novels and started kind of working towards that. But I had a problem. I'm of the opinion that like nobody's born a writing expert or a Bruce expert or an
Right.
artist, an expert artist, right? You got to be constantly learning things. Like I take classes all the time on this kind of thing. So my big problem was plot. I didn't know how to tell a story. I didn't know how to make something page turnery, right? And that was the feedback I was getting back from agents, right? So at the end of the day, I bit the bullet and got myself a Master of Fine Arts degree, and that's when I published not a self-help book, The Misadventures of Marty Wu, which was published in 2016. And I'm working on another novel right now, which is a young adult novel based in the Antarctic. So it's good
Okay.
stuff.
And the Misadventures, I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, it's called Not a Self-Help Book,
Okay.
The Misadventures of Marty Wu. I should
Okay.
have sent you this link earlier. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Very nice. I will include a link to do it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's a fun title.
Yeah, you
And
know what? It's titles are a funny thing, and we're gonna get to this later on, right? But it's like one of the things I love about Bruce Springsteen is his mastery of titles. I
yes.
love the title work on it. Titles are like they're so the unappreciated workhorse of any work, right? And actually, it's funny that you call out the title of my novel because that was not its original title. And my publisher and I workshopped it for like 2 hours of the phone, just kind of batting things back and forth and trying to figure
Mhm.
it out. So yeah, people out there, don't underestimate the work that goes into a title.
So a year or so ago, someone did a parody article that in an alternate world, Bruce was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. And I will
Oh,
try to find the article for you and send it to you, because it talked about how his new collection of short stories was this, and basically they took all of Bruce's albums and turned them into collections of short stories, the idea. And I was like, I want to read these so bad.
that's
Yeah,
amazing. I
I will
love
find it and
that.
send it to you. It was very
Yes,
clever and
please.
interesting. Like, I think Western Stars is a collection of short stories that Zane Grey or
Mm-hmm.
Elmore Leonard could have written.
Mm,
I
mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
feels like that collection of stories.
I love that. I love that. I'm gonna have to go back and revisit all the albums now with that lens on. That's
Yeah,
really cool. And actually, I think I would, having read his memoir at
yeah,
like, breakneck speed. I'm sure you've read it as well.
yeah. In fact,
I
I was
mean,
going to ask you as a writer, you talk to me as a fan and as a writer. What did you think of the book?
oh, I was just so many times I was laughing so hard at, especially in the early parts, right?
Sure.
But I was also really taken by his vulnerability, right? Which is a thing
Yes.
that we preach a lot in the creative nonfiction world, right? The idea that you have to be willing to let the reader in and give them a little piece of yourself, right? And the beauty of the book is that once it's down on paper, you don't have to do it over again. Do you know what I mean? You don't
Right.
have to tell that story over and over again. And in fact, when my memoir came out, there's a lot of pain around being a minority woman in outdoor sports, right? You come across a lot of things. I used to be involved in adventure racing, which is a sport that takes you into like the deep wilds of places, and they're often overnight races, and it's multidisciplinary. So you mountain bike, canoe, kayak. Sometimes there's horseback riding. There's usually rappelling going on. Um, and I would get things called at me. People would throw water bottles at us. They would say terrible things, because we were in the sticks, right? And they'd never seen an Asian girl before. Um, and that kind of narrative, when you have to tell it over and over again, it creates kind of a hole in you, right? It
Yeah.
carves out this. It's like this never-ending festering wound because you have to tell the story over again. But when the memoir came out, I found myself in the really bizarre position of not having to tell those stories anymore. It was like,
Hmm.
I've let this go now. I've committed it to paper. And I think that's a lot of what was going on in Born to Run, the memoir, where I think Springsteen had a lot of pain around when he realized, for instance, that he was going to have to use his stardom as a platform. He was going to have to be an activist in some way, shape, or form, right? He was going to have to be an activist for clean energy, right? He was going to have to be an activist for Black and Brown lives. He was going to have to be an activist for anybody who didn't have any rights, i.e., the Vietnam vets, right? And that's a thing that I think he had to come to terms with and look at on paper and be like, oh my God, this is a thing that I've now committed to paper, right? It is real. It has
Yes.
happened. And so I'm telling that story, right? I'm committing that. So in that way, I found it really, really admirable. The thing that I think was really funny about it is that as as a master of fine arts level instructor, Bruce was really earnest. There were a lot of exclamation points. There were whole lines that were written in all caps. And like, weren't we told a long time ago never to send emails in all caps because it makes you look like you're screaming at
Yes.
people? So,
I wondered about that, and I have said this before. At times, Bruce is not a very good interview. Now, I think he has gotten better, and I really enjoyed the podcast with him and President Obama. I thought that
uh-huh.
there was good stories there, and I
Yeah.
thought they shared. But at times, he laughs at his own jokes, and he seems uncomfortable talking about himself in the
Okay.
past.
Yeah.
Seems like, and especially like a lot of the Letter to You promotions, I thought
Mm,
he shared a lot. But I believe so. I was a little worried when I got into the book, like, well,
yeah.
how comfortable with this? And you know, the story, the legend, right, is that he
Yeah.
showed up, with this manuscript to the publishing company and go, I guess because they had published Outlaw Pete or something, the little
Okay.
children's book, and like, I guess you're my publisher. Would you want to read, publish this? And I'm wondering, if you're an editor, like, what do you go to Bruce and go, all these rules you're breaking, or do you just go, nope, because I read it and was just captivated by the
Yeah,
honesty.
yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. Well, okay, so one of the things I discovered early on when I first started writing creative nonfiction
Yeah,
earnestly, I had an allergy to earnestness. It was like
yeah,
the writer has to be a little bit removed. We have
yeah,
to be professorial and elegant and
yes,
so on and so forth. One mustn't ever show one's dirty underbits, right?
right,
One shouldn't be too emotional. Well, that's all not true. That's the
yeah,
way you hook people, right? That's the way that you begin to get them on side with you.
yeah,
Where they begin to feel like they have some stake in who you are, right? And I think Bruce does that really, really well, right? He just
yeah,
lets us see who he is, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
yeah. And I was really surprised that the the relationship with his father is all over the book, and his fights with depression and the honesty he shared with that. J. Michael Straczynski, the guy who did Babylon 5 and so many other TV shows, and just a year or two put out an autobiography called Becoming Superman, and it
Mm,
talks about his life. And the first third of the book is him as a child, is absolutely heartbreaking
wow.
because of how rough of a childhood he had.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
then and but I couldn't walk away because I knew this was real and this was
Yeah.
honest, and sharing that,
Yeah.
and not in a way, like, it was very, I think it was very honest of Bruce to say that Patty goes, you better go back to the doctor and maybe adjust your meds because you're not yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've mentioned your spouse, and Linda and I have been married since '84, so we've been this well. And there are plenty of times where, you know, she calls me on my crap and I call her on her crap, and because of that relationship, and it showed how much of a partnership they've had.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, and I think there's vulnerability in that, in the way that he talks about his first wife as well,
Yes.
and not being able to manage that relationship and being not mature enough for it. But I think one thing that really struck me is that, and I mentioned this in the essay, is that I've been doing a lot of work around the idea of different modes of storytelling, right?
Right.
And different traditions of storytelling, right? I love this story about my dad always cracks me up, where when I first moved back to California to be closer to them about a decade ago, my dad said to me, "I would like to write an autobiography." And I said, "Oh, that's great, Dad." And he was like, I think you can, it'd be great if you could get your professional eye on it. It's terrific. It's terrific chance for us to work together, so on and so forth. And I said, yeah, that's terrific. So he hands me the first couple of pages, and the first few pages start out 5,000 years ago in China. And I was like, I got on my high horse, right? I was like, Dad, this is not an autobiography. This is not the way that, people want to
Yeah.
read about you. They want to know about you, right? But that's a very Western way of looking at the autobiography, right? In the Eastern tradition, in the Taiwanese tradition, there is no me without all of this background that went before. So my father could not tell the story of himself without going in that background, right? So the thing that really struck me is that here I am preaching about how important it is to be really global about our traditions, right? I mean, the Aristotle methodology of storytelling is not the only methodology that exists, right?
Right.
So why am I bashing Bruce for being himself? Why am I
Yes.
bashing Bruce for using a ton of exclamation points when really, if he's singing to you, that's all you get is a ton of exclamation points
Absolutely.
and all
Yes.
caps in general. Like,
Yeah.
you cannot picture the lyrics to Pink Cadillac without it being all caps with a lot of exclamation
Oh,
points. It's
absolutely.
impossible. Right? So,
Yeah. So after your friend, this songwriter, you know, asked you and kind of opened your eyes in Thunder Road, what are other albums and songs that you've kind of explored and have personal meaning for you, and that both as emotionally and also maybe as a storyteller?
yeah, for me, it's the earlier albums.
Okay.
So the is it I never know the names of the albums. Well, Nebraska is a big one for me,
Yeah.
but also The Wild and the Crazy and the E Street Band. Is that right, or is it The Wild and the
Wild and
Innocent?
the Innocent. And then,
Thank you. The
yeah.
Wild and the Innocent and the E Street Band. Right. So those are the two albums that I'm kind of looking at most closely right now, and the ones that have resonated with me in the past. I find the Greetings from Asbury Park album really interesting,
Yeah.
only because it feels really raw to me. It
Yeah.
feels like a really raw piece of music to me. And even in the lyrics to that are, that entire album are just fascinating to me. So, yeah, I mean, it just appeals to me as a human being, really.
And it's almost, now that you think about that, right? Like a first novel that,
Absolutely.
and um, I tend to read, mystery novels with their series, so you have the same characters or other novels, and you sometimes will find, that he or she has not figured out their style yet and what we're wanting to be. And I think that's, when you put it in that way, that's, he's still trying to figure out. And, in that Letter to You documentary, he talked about, Dylan telling John Hammond, this guy's going to run out of words on the dictionary, because Bruce wanted to
Right.
do that. And
Yeah.
speaking of the writer J. Michael Straczynski, he just put a book of how to write, and he specifically says, I'm aiming for people that want to write. And he had a whole chapter about editing,
Wow,
and
that's great.
he said, and the paragraph that you just read started out this way. And and he showed the actual process of like cutting out the words and cutting out the words and cutting out the words, and then going back again and saying, did I cut out too many words?
Oh
And
my
it was
gosh.
fascinating to think that. And you could see how Bruce learned that less is more.
I love what you just said about J. Michael Straczynski. I think that's such a generous act for any writer to, show us what they had to go through in order to be able to get to the point that they are now. I
Yeah.
mean that it's not just generous, but it also shows a remarkable lack of ego, which is exactly where you want to be. You can't be too precious
Yeah.
about your own words, right? So
Yeah.
that's fantastic. Thank you for letting me know about that.
Yeah. It is the name of the book. By the way, he just did a novel, Together We Will Go,
Oh, cool.
which the premise is, um, a guy wants to commit suicide. He reaches out via social media and gets a bus full of like 8 or 9 people, and their idea is they're going to go across the U.S., get to the Pacific coast, and drive off a bridge. Drive off a
Wow.
cliff. And so it's a little uncomfortable,
Uh-huh.
because as a society, suicide is bad.
Yeah.
Suicide is bad.
Yeah.
Very fascinating novel. But the name of his book is Becoming a Writer, Staying a Writer.
Okay, great.
And it is it and I was fascinated by the editing, because he said, this is like, and the choosing the right word and what to do. And he said, you never should show anyone your first draft, that you should be your own critic, and you should go through that. And it was just interesting.
That's great.
Yeah. Do have you, as I often say, the amount of times you've seen Bruce perform live is not a fair barometer of your
Yeah.
fandom, but have you been able to see him?
I have. I have seen Bruce exactly once, and it
Okay.
was it was there in the early 2000s that I had that really distinct feeling of like,
Yes.
is it okay for me to sing along with Born in the USA,
Yeah.
right? And I really locked up. It was like everything else was fantastic. Right? Rosalita
Yeah.
was great. Thunder Road, I
Yeah.
still didn't know all the words to, but that was
Yeah.
fantastic. Born in Rome was great. And then we got to Born in the USA, and it was like
Yeah.
I just locked up, and I didn't know what to do with myself, right? It was like, and it was very, very odd because we were, at the time I was working in advertising. And so it was one of those client events, right, where we would buy out
Yeah.
a block of tickets and bring people along with us. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is not a good face to be putting on for my clients, right? Get it together.
Um, so I was raised Southern Baptist, So, where that, you know, this was a fact that you went from standing, you sip one beer, the next step you're in the gutter, right? Like, that it just, do not pass go, do not kick $200. If you have one sip of beer, you're then a drunk in the gutter. Um, feeling uncomfortable singing Joy to the World, because he always had some very good wine. Like, something like that was uncomfortable to me. Um, and My wife is Catholic, and I've since converted to Catholicism, though
Uh-huh.
I have a very complicated spiritual relationship right now. But and it was just very weird
Yeah.
being raised Catholic that, you know, alcohol was, not, it was just not a big thing,
Right.
you know, and I still am amazed that my mother will will have beer in the refrigerator for my when my adult son visits. I'm like, what? So
It's like a paradigm shift,
yeah,
it's
it
like
is a
a,
paradigm shift.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah. So, um, you said talk about what you're working on next. What kind of writing projects are you doing now?
Yeah, so I have this albatross of a novel that is I don't every novel is an albatross. I don't even know what I'm saying. It's true. So it's a young adult novel that is 5 years in the making now, and it's only 5 years in the making because I have a bunch of other projects that are going on. So,
Yeah.
but it's one I'm very excited about. It is a young adult novel, so I'm really excited about it, and I just have to hunker down and kind of get it done,
Okay.
right? I also am writing pretty frequently for Medium, which is where you found me, and for its various publications there. And generally, that's about self-improvement or about basic things like friendship and about finding Bruce Springsteen and being an
Mhm.
American immigrant, right? And let's see what else. Oh, I teach some diversity and inclusion for an incredible company called CanIPlayThat.com, which
Okay.
is a media organization that assesses video games for accessibility. So,
Oh, okay.
if you're low vision or if you're disabled in some way, shape, or form, can you play this video game, right? So, we're working with video game creators and game developers to make sure that their game narratives are as inclusive as possible and that they appeal to the widest audiences. So, it's a lot of big projects and they're like all over the place, but it's all good fun.
That
It's all
sounds
good stuff.
good.
Yeah.
And you know, I how have you been doing in the pandemic? How has it been?
Well, stuff like this is getting me through. Being able to
Yeah.
meet new people like yourself. I just did a piece on how, like, where are we in the pandemic now? Are we 18 months in? What is
Yes.
time,
Yeah,
Jesse? What is
exactly.
time?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, geez. So, okay, so back in like January of 2020, I sold a Formica table from the 1950s to a woman on Craigslist. And we immediately knew that we were going to be friends, right? And then the pandemic happened, right? And so we just had like our first friend date last Saturday, and it was like an absolute joy.
That's
We did such middle-aged things. We went to a cafe and we had coffee, and then we went to a museum and looked at art, and then we had a glass of wine afterwards. It was like we were cut loose on the world. It was fantastic.
that
So
is
I just did a
awesome.
piece about our bizarre Craigslist friendship, which is kind of fun.
That sounds very fun. That
But
is
yeah, I
great.
mean, finding new podcasts like this and
Yeah.
just sort of like storytelling is keeping me alive right now, Jesse. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
all the stuff that I've been watching on Netflix. Oh my goodness, I just finished watching Pushing Daisies. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Oh, isn't it a joy?
It is just
Oh,
so wonderful.
it's so much fun. It's so much
Yeah.
fun. I'm watching Lupin now. Just realized that the next season of Winona Earp is up again. Have you been watching Winona Earp?
Yes, I love Winona Earp.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's such a joy.
It
Talk about a
is.
potty mouth, right? Boy, she stirs
Right.
up a storm. She's
It is.
fantastic.
It is very good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great. So yeah, I mean, storytelling is keeping me alive, and both in the generative sense and in the consuming sense. So
Hmm.
yeah, all that good stuff.
That's good. That's good. All right. So, Ishan, what should I have asked you that I haven't?
You need to ask me about my favorite Bruce Springsteen songs.
All right, let's do it. Let's go for it.
Okay, so I made a list for you. Okay, New York City
Yay.
Serenade,
All
I
right.
need to, and that's the one I have to see performed live because it is so
That
big in
that is
scope,
on your
right?
wish list. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's on my wish list, no question about it. Used cars, I love. And I love it for a very, very odd reason. I love it because even though I grew up not wanting for money, the sensation that he describes of being a poor family, and everybody watching them pull up in their used car and all that, that is the way that I felt as an immigrant in a mostly white town. And it was just like, I remember hearing that song for the first time and being like, oh, again, it was like that sense of like, this is such an American songwriter. Why do I resonate so much with it? Right. And so it locked into place this idea of like, what is American? What does it mean to be American? You know?
So a couple things. First off, I think of that line in the and why am I drawing a blank on the movie about the guy set in the UK, right? That's Pakistan. And his dad says, hey, I think this Bruce Springsteen is Pakistani, because he writes about that. Um, the One of my favorite stories, right, is that um, just because you write the story or write the song doesn't mean you know what it is about. And I my dad was in the military, career military. My mother did not work outside the home, so we struggled financially at times. I didn't. I know that now. At the time, I kind of sort of knew, but and
Parents keep it from you, don't they?
yeah,
Yeah.
and I know um, the like I called, my mom when I was a junior in high school and said, okay, the payphone at the high school. And I said, all right, this is how much they're talking for a class ring, and she's like,
Yeah.
no, your dad and I've talked, and you're graduating high school, whatever it is, you pick what you want, Jesse. Don't
Oh,
worry about it,
yeah.
So that feeling, and my parents always did buy new used cars. So that resonated with me. But the story is about alienation
Yeah.
and not belonging and
Yep.
resenting not belonging, and you were able to change that to a totally that has nothing to do with the vehicle, right?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because the narrative is flipped for me because my parents' cars they were status symbols, right? So
Right.
it was like, they were one of the first families to have a Lexus, right?
Yeah.
They were one of the first ones in the neighborhood to buy like a big honking Mercedes Benz, right? And
Right.
so the narrative around cars is solid, but it's flipped, right? It's sort of like so the car is a status symbol still, just not in that same way, right?
Right.
And in much that same way, I also love Highway Patrolman, which is a story about family fealty, right? And that story resonates so hard for me because both my parents' families are huge on family fealty, right? Like that is a thing that you just do not mess with. It doesn't
Right.
matter. It doesn't matter what the person did, they will always be family, and you
Right.
gotta appreciate that, right? And I think this is the kind of thing that really makes me feel so much better about Springsteen and Born in the USA is that in the book, in Born to Run, he explores this idea of what it means to be American, and it is a
Yes.
question for him. It's a question for him. Am I truly American if I do not use my star status to protest, right? Am I truly American if I did not serve in the Vietnam War? Am I truly American if this, that, and the other thing, right? What does it actually mean? Am I truly American if I decide to ally myself with the blue cause as opposed to the red cause, right?
Yes.
And I think for me, the thing that really locked it in was like, if Bruce Springsteen, the guy who's saying born in the USA, can question what it means to be an American, I get to do it too. And you know
Yes.
what? All that is American. That is 100% American. That is the great American experiment, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's where it came down. It's just fascinating to me.
And I do think that's fascinating. And I do think we go back to that sometimes someone can have a very narrow mindset of what is America, right? And
Right.
and I think of the American President, the film that Aaron Sorkin wrote, right, where Michael Douglas talks about where at his closing speech about you get people that have remember a a better time, and and you scare them about what's changed and what's different, and um, it and your American experience is totally different than my American experience, but there was a time, and and mostly because at the time it was a European thing, right? The the melting pot, the quilt was all from these different European, but we now are global, and there is that different, that it is truly a different, bigger and quilt and melting pot. And I
Absolutely.
think that's well said, that that is your American experience is just as valid as anything else.
Yeah, and I so appreciate the opportunity to share it with you here, and I've just so enjoyed this conversation, and I feel like we're winding down to the big question.
Yes, we are. Yes. Now, is there other songs you want to bring up? That, by the
Okay,
way,
I'll just bring up one more.
Highway Patrolman, one of my favorite songs. I love Johnny Cash's version. I
Oh,
don't
I've
know if
not
you've
heard it.
no Google, and yeah, Johnny Cash did a version of Highway Patrolman, and it is absolutely amazing. Yeah,
Wonderful.
great song, great song.
Okay,
So
good.
okay,
All right. Okay, so the last one, and this might only be because I actually do know a guy who ran away to join the circus. You already know
okay,
what I'm gonna say. It's
yes.
Wild Billy's circus story,
Oh,
right? Like
that's
that.
funny.
And I'll tell you what, the day that Dave told me that he had actually had run away to join the circus, like that was his thing. I was like, oh, let's revisit the song together.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Yes, I would want to know that. That is
That's great.
great. Yeah. All right. So, if you are Yanshi's family or co-workers or
Uh-huh.
friends, and you're listening to this and you've never heard a Set Listing Bruce episode before, we end every episode with a Mary question. And Jay Armstrong is an honors English teacher. He just recently retired, but every year in his senior class, he would have his honors English class take Thunder Road and break it down as a poem, and they would go through all the different lyrics. They would talk about the imagery that Bruce uses. It would compare it to other poems, including poems from Robert Frost. And at the end of the 2 days, the question he would ask his class, and they would write a paper on it: does Mary get in the car? So, Youngji, that's your question.
Okay, so the question is, does Mary get in the car? And like I told you, I have been thinking about this for like ever since I found out that it was going to be a thing. Um, I
Which
think
makes
if
me
I'm
so happy.
so if I'm being a romantic, I would say that Bruce has been very, very persuasive this entire time. And
Right.
the line that tips it over the edge for me is when he says, um, it, "I know it's late, but we can make it if we run." I love that line
That is
so
what a
much.
great, I know it's late, but we can make it if we run.
Yeah,
It's
I
just
love
so
it.
beautiful.
It is, and it's such a sentiment of like, come with me, right? And I think a little bit too, it's kind of like bound up in that whole the line from Born to Run where he says, "Wendy, let me in. I want to be your friend. I want to guard your dreams and visions." Like, could you ever ask for any more from a life partner than that,
Exactly.
right? So the romantic in me says, yes, she gets in the car, no question about it. But if you ask me tomorrow, I might have a different answer altogether.
Okay. So can you take the romantic hat on and make the other argument?
I can't now. I can't because
Okay.
see, I've been thinking about this whole like, how persuasive he's been the
Yeah.
entire day now. We're at the end of the day. We're
Hmm.
gonna have to like turn over tomorrow and see.
Okay.
So okay, so if I'm forced to think about whether or not she
And
doesn't
it's
get in
okay
the
if you don't
car.
want to. I just was curious. The way you said, if I have the romantic hat on,
Yeah,
uh, yeah.
I don't know, Jesse. Like, I kind of want to go there, but then I'm kind of like, no, I think we'll save that for tomorrow. We're gonna go
Okay.
down another road tomorrow. Because it isn't just whether or not she gets in the car, is it? It's whether or not she gets in the car and what they do afterwards. Like,
Exactly.
what do they do? Do they go stare at the Jersey shoreline, or do they make a bolt for New York City, or do they go to Washington D.C., or do they drive straight across country like he did with his mates? I mean.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't
Well,
know. So,
and I, the amount of diversity I've had in the answers, right? That people have said that they're like, no, she doesn't get in the car because he wasn't worthy of it, but later she does. Later he grows, and then there's other like, yes, she gets in the car, but it doesn't last very long.
right.
Uh, you know,
Right.
um, one of my favorites is he says absolutely, because on Racing in the Street, they
Uh-huh.
talk about that she sits on her daddy's porch which is the porch that they talked about.
Right.
And then, as I've said many times, one guy says Moonlight Motel is the sequel to Thunder Road, that
Absolutely.
they go to California, they spend their lives together, and now then he's mourning Mary.
Oh,
So
I love it. I love it.
yeah,
And again, so many different ways to interpret the rest of his discography, right after
yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. But I'm so happy to see this question come up because, like I say, I'm the kind of person that likes to imagine conversations. So you've given me plenty to think about for probably the rest of my life.
So I tweeted this, but Brian Koppelman, the showrunner of Billions,
Hmm.
and wrote Rounders, and he has a podcast, and he said, "Hey, we're going to do an Ask Brian episode of the podcast, so send questions." And so his daughter asked the questions, and she read my Mary question,
I love
and
it.
and he said that he'd never thought about it, and he thinks the beauty is not knowing. He
Oh,
loves the idea that we don't know if she gets in the car, and he thinks the song loses power if we know. And I
interesting.
think that is a very interesting thought. And
Yeah, I
it's
love
kind of,
that.
yeah, it's kind of like there is a reason why Bruce chose the anthem music of Born in the USA and not the blues version like he does on Broadway.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
he is a master storyteller, and he
sure.
know what image he was going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I say in my essay too that the beauty of that song is that it just seems to go on and on and on and on,
Yeah.
right? So for me it's maybe not as exact as the beauty is that we don't know. It's that the beauty is that we know that the story will go on,
Yes.
regardless, of what
Yeah.
happens, right? So it's
Absolutely.
interesting, these little nuances, right? I mean, these
Yes.
tiny little trenches of the way that we think about these stories and the way we think about these
Yeah.
lives. It's
Yeah.
great. It's great.
Sean, this has been amazing. I hope you had fun.
I've so
This is
enjoyed myself.
this is good. If someone wants to reach you, what's the best way?
Please find me on Twitter. I practically live there. I will tell you
Yes.
what I ate for breakfast. It's great. I'm at Good Dirt on Twitter. And if you want to read some more thoughts, most currently at yushanlai.medium.com.
Okay. Good.
Great.
And I will include links to that. I'll include links. I'm gonna have to check out the books.
Fabulous.
I definitely want the fiction, but the idea of your struggle with sports sounds like it could be pretty funny.
It's
It,
pretty funny.
yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be great.
It's
Um,
pretty funny.
Good. Any final thoughts you want to share?
No, I'm just so happy to be here, and like I say, I'm super grateful that this medium exists and that we can make new friends and get to know each other, and I'm just really grateful that you exist in this world, and I wish you so many more podcasts, and I'll be there for all of them.
Well, I thank you so much, and let's make a deal. When you finish your latest Albatross, you got to come on and we'll promote it. Okay?
Yes, please. That sounds great, Jesse.
All right,
Thank
that sounds
you.
great. All right, listeners, please be safe. Go get vaccinated. Wear a mask, remember to social distance, wash your hands. And, I always say, let's be good to each other, but let's be goodish to each other. I guess I should say that now.
Well done, Jesse. Yeah, nice work.
And, and because that's the only way we're going to get through this. For now, thank you, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Thank you to my Patreons: Andrew Goddard, Betsy Hodges, Levi Petri, Elizabeth Bronson, Stephen Malio, Holly Mack, Steve Rogers, Dale Hosick, Terry Smith, Anna Lynn, Chris Bloom, and Mary Thomas. You all are my monthly angels. Thank you so much for the love and support you give on this podcast. You are greatly appreciated.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. Set Listing Bruce is part of the Southgate Media podcast group. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.